As we continue our look at archaeology and the Old Testament, we are dealing in this section with some international conflict between Israel and its neighbors. First of all, the nation of Israel became powerful and expanded and interacted and conquered several times at various places in Israel. Nineveh fell in 611 to the Babylonians. The Babylonians also invaded several times and had much conflict and contact with the Israelite nation. But Babylon was destroyed in 539 BC by the Persians. And they then also had contact with the Israelites in some very interesting ways. But Persia had problems later then with the Greeks, and the Greeks rose to power around 480 at the Battle of Salamis, which the Persians lost. And of course, the next major world empire was the Romans, which came in the 1st century BC to have an impact on Israel as well. So let's look first at Israel and Assyria. You can see on this chart several of the Assyrian kings. The first one being Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 858 to 824. We have two major inscriptions which we'll look at in just a few minutes. But if you look at the next several Assyrian kings, each one of them, consecutive rulers, is mentioned in Scripture for quite some time in the span of history, until the fall of Nineveh in 611 BC. First, let's look at the Black Obelisk. The Black Obelisk records some of the conquest of Shalmaneser III. He was king of Assyria from 858 to 824 BC. The Black Obelisk was found in 1846 at Nimrod by Austin Henry Layard. And interestingly, on one of the side panels, we have Shalmaneser III pictured, who you can read about in 2 Kings 17 and 18. But we also have an actual picture of King Jehu, who ruled Israel from 841 to 814 BC. You can read about this in 2 Kings 9 and 10. To date, this is the only extant inscription or monument with an actual picture of an Israelite king. This monument is in the British Museum in London. I was able to visit there in 1976 and see this phenomenal discovery. Also from the time of Shalmaneser III is the Kirk monolith inscription, discovered in 1861 by John George Taylor in Kirk, Turkey. This is now in the British Museum. This describes the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Ahab, king of Israel, had contributed 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers to help fight Shalmaneser III. This inscription is in the British Museum in London. In his own words, he describes the finding of this inscription. I had the good fortune to discover a stone slab bearing the effigy of an Assyrian king and covered on both sides with long inscriptions in the cuneiform character to within 2 feet of its base, which had been purposely left bare to admit of it being sunk erect into the ground, as a trophy commemorative of its capture by the king, and at the point probably where his legions effected their forced entry into the city. The fact that here Ahab and Ben-Hadad of Damascus appear next to each other, and that in an inscription of this same king, Shalmaneser's, Nimrod obelisk appears Jehu, son of Omri, and commemorates the descent of Hazael of Damascus. It leaves no doubt that this Ahab is the biblical Ahab of Israel. Reading part of this inscription from Shalmaneser III, Karkar, his royal city, I destroyed. I devastated. I burned with fire. 1,200 chariots, 1,000 cavalry, 20,000 soldiers of Hadadezer of Aram. 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, 10,000 soldiers of Eruhu of Hamath, and 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. The Bible record of this is in 1 Kings chapter 16. Other Assyrian inscriptions and finds, this one from Tiglath-Pileser, dates from around 800 years before Christ, discovered in 1993. King Menahem of Israel and Pul are taken into captivity by the Assyrians, according to these inscriptions. You can read about this in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 and also 2 Kings chapter 15. An amazing confirmation of Bible history through these Assyrian monuments. And then another interesting find, this courtyard gate to the palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad. Sargon II ruled from 722 to 705 BC. This was discovered by Paul Emilibada in 1843. Sargon II claims to have destroyed Samaria, the capital of the northern 10 tribes of Israel, in 722 BC. For a while, there were no known finds of his name anywhere, and so some skeptics doubted that he ever existed. He's mentioned in Isaiah chapter 20 in verse 1, and now with these discoveries, confirmation of his existence is widely accepted. The Taylor Prism, which is in the British Museum, was discovered in 1830. And it records the expeditions and conquests of Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the king of Assyria in 705 to 681 BC. In 701 BC, Sennacherib invaded Israel. That's recorded on this prism, and a couple of others, by the way, record the same events. 46 cities were conquered by Sennacherib, and Hezekiah the king of Israel, Judah actually, is mentioned by name. And he says, Hezekiah is shut up like a bird in a cage. You can read about this in 2 Kings 18 and 19. It was during this time, or shortly before this time, that Hezekiah the king saw the need to get a water supply into Jerusalem. So he had a tunnel built to bring water from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam. This tunnel was discovered by Edward Robinson in 1838. In one of my visits to Israel, I was able to walk through this tunnel, and what a thrill it was to see history and to know that King Hezekiah from the Bible had this built to help him withstand the conquest of the Assyrians. The Sloan Inscription was found about halfway through the tunnel because they started from each end and worked towards each other. How they ever met in the middle, I'll never know, but they did. And this may well have saved them from being conquered by King Sennacherib. Even though he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage, as the inscription says, it doesn't claim that he actually conquered Jerusalem at that time. Part of the Sloan Inscription reads as follows: "And when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed the rock, each man toward his fellow, axe against axe. And the water flowed from the springs toward the reservoir for 1,200 cubits. And the height of the rock above the heads of the quarrymen was 100 cubits. Also from the time of King Hezekiah, a seal with his name was found in 1986, and it says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Again, an amazing confirmation of a king of Israel, King Hezekiah, one of the good kings who tried to reform and bring Israel back to the way of God. Lachish was overthrown by Sennacherib on this same invasion in 701 BC. You can read about this in Isaiah 36 and 2 Kings chapter 18. Evidently, it's such a significant conquest that on Sennacherib's palace wall he had inscriptions and a relief made that covered a great amount of his palace. This was discovered by Austin Henry Laird in 1847. It's now in the British Museum, and it was found in Nineveh, dating back to around 700 years before Christ. And you can see the various aspects of the siege and the destruction of Lachish in Israel. Another king later on, Ezra Haden, has recorded some of his exploits, and In 550 to 400 BC, this inscription was made, and it mentions King Ezra Haden. It was discovered, the inscription was, in 1811, and you can read about this contact with the Israelites in 2 Kings 19 and also in Isaiah chapter 37. From the 6th century BC, we have what's called the House of God, or House of Yahweh, ostracon. Again, an ostracon is pottery with writing on it. It was found at Arad in 1962. And it's the earliest extra-biblical reference to the temple in Jerusalem. Babylon conquered Nineveh, and the Assyrian Empire fell in 611 BC. Babylon was the next great world power. They also had much contact and conquest in Israel. Several of the kings of Babylon are mentioned on this chart, and several of them we find also in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar, Amil-Marduk, Nergal-Sharezer, and Nabonidus. All are mentioned in the Bible, and we have inscriptions from them as well. Babylon falls to Cyrus in 539 BC. Prior to that time, Babylon had a great impact on Israel. You can still see in Iraq to this day the ruins at Babylon of a very great capital city of a great empire. And found in Iraq are some of the inscriptions from this time when Babylon was of great power. This is the Sarscom tablet from around 586 BC. It was discovered in 1880 and came to light again in 2007. Many inscriptions and tablets are found and taken to museums and never deciphered, never translated for many, many years. There are literally thousands of these type of tablets that have not yet been deciphered. In this Sarscom tablet, it actually mentions Sarscom, who was Nebuchadnezzar's chief officer during the siege of Jerusalem. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 3 and 4. In a recent article in Biblical Archeology Review, the article mentions that there were over 50 people whose names are in the Bible, and now these names have been found in various inscriptions. The Nabonidus cylinder from 540 BC was discovered by John Taylor in 1854. It mentions Nabonidus and Belshazzar, both mentioned in Daniel chapter 5. And then also the Nabonidus Chronicle, dating from around 556 to 539 BC, discovered in 1882. Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned earlier. This is Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Again, from Daniel chapter 5 through 8, these two inscriptions mention these two Babylonian kings. And of course, from the ruins of the city of Babylon, some of the bricks had actual name of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. From 605 to 561 BC. You can read about this in 2 Kings 24 and 25, and also Daniel chapter 1. So it's amazing to see so many of these biblical kings and their relationships with the kings of Babylon. One of the interesting things is we actually have a record of the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. There were 3 invasions, and Nebuchadnezzar led one of them around 597 BC. And this is an actual account from the Babylonian perspective of that invasion. You can read the biblical account in 2 Kings chapter 24. The Babylonians took many captives in their invasions. They took them to the city of Babylon. And of all things, they kept records of what they fed their captives. Jehoiachin was one of the kings that was from Judah taken, and it's actually been found in this inscription how much they fed him. This records his rations for Jehoiachin from 609 to 598 BC. Also includes his sons while they were captive, how much they were fed. Discovered in 1900 in Babylon. You can read about this in 2 Kings chapter 25. Now, the Assyrians, you might recall, overthrew Lachish in 701. Well, the Babylonians in 589 did the same thing. and overthrow Lachish again. From Lachish, from that time, we have found some ostraca, which records the destruction from the Jewish point of view by Nebuchadnezzar. Several people from Scripture are mentioned. Hoshea, Jeremiah chapter 42 and chapter 43 are mentioned there. These are people that are named and endured the captivity or the destruction in Lachish and record how it occurred. It's quite dramatic to read. Well, Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BC. Persia was the next great world empire. And actually, during the Babylonian captivity, during the time of Jeremiah, he had predicted that there would be 70 years of captivity. Jerusalem was destroyed in 605, again in 597, and again in the 5th century, even earlier. But Babylon was captured by the Persians in 539, and Cyrus was the one who destroyed and captured Babylon, and it was his policy to allow captives of the Babylonians to go back to their land. In the Persian period, after Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539, his son Cambyses ruled up until 522, and then Darius rules from 522 to 486. We mentioned earlier that Xerxes then is the next ruler of Persia, and he attacks Greece to expand his empire. But Xerxes is defeated at Salamis by the Greeks, and the Greeks' rise to power begins. Artaxerxes rules next in Persia, and it's during the time of Nehemiah, and they have contact as well. Interesting, between Baghdad and Tehran, the road goes through some mountains, and on one of the mountains there is a relief and inscription from Darius, king of Persia. It's over 500 feet high to reach the inscription. It's 58.5 feet long. It's the largest inscription in the Middle East. It's in Elamite, Old Persian, and Babylonian. And it became the key for deciphering the reading of these languages. Henry Rawlinson copied it in 1835 and then begins deciphering and reading the Persian script. Another very important inscription that has helped decipher these ancient languages was the Rosetta Stone, which was discovered in Egypt in 1799 by soldiers in Napoleon's army. Napoleon had campaigned in Egypt from 1798 to 1801. He's defeated, and so the spoils that he gathered went to the British Museum, who were victorious. This trilingual edict was deciphered by Jean-Francois Champollion, and it's now in the British Museum. The Rosetta Stone was originally much larger, was broken, and parts were lost. A scaled-down replica of the Rosetta Stone can be seen in the Clayton Museum of Ancient History on the campus of York College in York, Nebraska. There are many other artifacts from ancient times in this museum, which is very interesting and certainly worth your while to visit and see firsthand some of these ancient artifacts. Cyrus the Great has his tomb in Parsagard, Iran. And Cyrus is the one, as I mentioned earlier, who made it his policy to return captives to their homeland. Another inscription from the tomb of Cyrus the Great reads as follows: O man, whoever thou art, and whencesoever thou comest, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, and I won the Persians their empire. Do not, therefore, begrudge me this little earth which covers my body. The Cyrus Cylinder, which dates from 539 to 530 BC, was discovered in 1879, and it records the policy of Cyrus to return captives to their land. And of course, we can read about this same event in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 23. From part of the Cyrus Cylinder, we read these words from Cyrus: I return to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. So it was the policy of the Persians, and Cyrus in particular, to return captives back to their former lands. And of course the Jews at this time or soon thereafter were returned to Jerusalem. However, some of them did choose to stay in Babylon as well. And again, one of the later kings of Persia, Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 425 BC. This was found a silver bowl with his name on it, and Artaxerxes and Darius. And of course in Esther, these kings are mentioned. So an amazing find with these kings' names from Persia. One of the capital cities is Persepolis in southern Iran. There the great palace of Darius can be seen. Monumental structure, tremendous palace. Darius ruled from 522 to 486, and his kingdom was covered much of the Middle East. There is a relief there on some of the palace walls which mentions Darius, and this is the same king that we find mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah. King Darius also is found on this clay tablet. This was acquired in Egypt. It's now in the British Museum, and this again confirms King Darius, the one that's mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah. As we come to the end of this segment, we look forward to the time between the Old and New Testament. Recall that Nineveh fell to the Babylonians in 611 BC. Babylon then falls to the Persians in 539, and Persia falls to the Greeks in 330. Rome begins its ascension and domination of the Mediterranean world around 63 and earlier BC. Some important dates to recall as we look at the time between the Testaments. Between the Old Testament and New Testament, there are 400 years. And some have called these the 400 silent years. But actually many events took place, and these 400 silent years are really not so silent. There were major changes in world empires and also in the biblical world. As you might recall, in 539, Persia, under Cyrus, conquers Babylon. And so Cyrus then allows the captives to return to the homelands, a great change in the biblical world as the exiles return to Judea. And of course in Scripture, Ezra goes to Judah in 458, Nehemiah goes in 444. The Persians begin their attempt to conquer the Greek mainland, but they're defeated at Marathon in 490 BC. The Persians do, however, sack Athens, but then they were defeated at Salamis in 480. Next world power is the Greek Empire, beginning with the father of Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon, who came to power in 359. Alexander the Great is born in 356, and in 331 he conquers Persia. He dies in 323. His empire is divided amongst 4 of his generals. One of the generals, Ptolemy, who got Egypt and that area, fought with the Seleucid Empire and actually captures Judea in 301 BC. The Septuagint is written in Alexandria, Egypt, around 285. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Many Jewish people had gone down to Egypt to trade, and so they needed a translation that they could understand. And Aramaic was gradually going out of vogue, so Greek became the language. One of the reasons, or one of the results of the Greek culture being spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The Seleucids, though, then conquer Ptolemy V, his area, in 200, and so Judea now falls under the Seleucid control. Well, this causes great anxiety and anger, and some of the Jewish people revolt, and the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt begins in 167. The Catholic Bible contains some books that was not contained in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. The 1st and 2nd Maccabees record these events in their pages, the Maccabean Revolt of 167. Simon Maccabeus actually established as an independent Jewish state in 142. So the Jews have their own homeland for some several years. Next, though, Rome comes to the picture as ascending and growing, and Rome defeats the Seleucid king Antiochus in 200 BC. And then later, Pompey intervenes in the civil war that's going on in Israel, and that's how the Romans get involved in this part of the country. And so that changes greatly, and that's how the Romans are in control during the time of Jesus. But, as you might recall, Herod the Great was the king when Jesus was born. He had been appointed by the Romans. Just as somewhat of a review and to see the area of these empires, the Persian Empire beginning around 500 BC, and then the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great went all the way to India. And then, of course, here's a bust of Alexander the Great in the Bodmer Museum from Egypt from the 1st century BC. Alexander's empire, as I mentioned, was actually divided up by 4 of his generals. And so here's the division of his empire when he died very early. And these other Greek states were a part of this Antigonid kingdom. The Ptolemaic kingdom was in the south, containing Egypt and up into Israel, part way. And then the Seleucid kingdom all the way to India. The Roman Empire, at perhaps its greatest extent around 100 AD, then encompasses most of the Mediterranean world. This concludes our look at some of the other nations and their contact with Israel. But it was clearly seen is that Israel was indeed a great nation. It had its troubles with others. But their names, places, and kings and so forth are mentioned not only on their own inscriptions, but also on the inscriptions of the surrounding nations. It's easy to see from the Bible that these other finds affirm and help us understand the reliability and trustworthiness of the Bible.